Welcome to this Killick Explains video. An advanced apologies for the fact that thanks to lockdown I can't do this in the studio. I hope to be doing more studio videos soon. In the meantime, it is Invisible Tim, just my voice and the usual 3-blob format. So this time the topic is the pros and cons of putting property into your pension. Something that people ask about a lot. I mean, they think, well, property is one of my bigger assets. I need to do something about funding life after work. So is there any way of combining the two things? And the answer is yes and no. So with no more ado, the background to this is what? Well, self-invested personal pensions are certainly very flexible, and increasing numbers of people are not being offered final salary or defined benefit pensions. They are reliant on some form of personal pension, and the self-invested one gives the most flexibility. Many assets can be held inside one: shares, bonds, funds, to name but three, and to some degree property. But here's where there is a degree of confusion. So let's first of all tighten up what we mean by property. So what type of property could you hold within a self-invested personal pension? Now, first of all, residential. And I'm afraid the answer here is a categoric no. You cannot simply put your house or a buy-to-let property inside your SIPP. However, that doesn't stop you holding property funds, and many people do just that. So there is a way to get exposure to property through, say, a commercial property fund that, in most cases, would be SIPP eligible. And then there's the thorny issue of commercial property, and this is the one I want to focus on. The other two are fairly black and white answers, but this is a yes with caveats. And since quite a few people ask about this, I want to deal with it in this video. So, commercial property. First of all, what is commercial property? Well, we're not talking about your main home. We're not talking about buy-to-let investments here. We could be talking about land. We could certainly be talking about buildings, offices, factories, for example. And then there are some odd ones that people often don't think about. First off, rivers and associated fishing rights attached to land, for example, have formed part of a bundle of assets that people have said, oh, could that be commercial? Could that potentially be held within a self-invested personal pension? Now, why would you want to do this? Why, let's assume you own commercial property and it looks like it's eligible commercial property, why would you want to hold it within a SIPP? Well, first of all, the income received from that property and capital gains would be tax-free once the thing is held within the SIPP umbrella, as it were. What's more, rent paid by the donor business is tax deductible. So the way to think about this is you've got, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you've got an office building. All right, that office building is held within a self-invested personal pension. There's an expectation that it'll be held there on commercial terms, held in trust within the SIPP on commercial terms, and therefore that it will be able to earn some form of rent. So as the owner of the business, your business would be expected to pay rent to the SIPP for the use of that property. But the advantage is that business asset itself within the SIPP is income tax and capital gains tax free. And there are potential inheritance tax benefits which apply generally to assets held within self-invested personal pensions. Because as a rule of thumb, personal pensions, private pensions are outside the scope of inheritance tax, are not part of the death estate in the way that other assets would be. So an example, for anyone thinking, well, how would this actually work? I hinted at this, but here's an example. Let's say a business owner transfers an office building into a self-invested personal pension. Now, I've made that sound incredibly easy. In a moment, I'll make it sound a little bit more difficult in practice. Any rent received by the SIPP is not taxed, and neither is any gain on the eventual sale of the property. And meanwhile, the commercial rent levied by the trustees for the use of the building is corporation tax deductible. So the business that is potentially occupying the building, paying rent, gets to deduct that against corporation tax. So you've got a potential income tax benefit, a potential capital gains tax benefit, a potential inheritance tax benefit, and even a potential corporation tax benefit. Surely it's win-win-win-win. Well, maybe, but not quite. Here comes the buts. Now, first of all, rent must be paid to the SIPP, or the owner of the business risks a breach of the agreement and legal action. It is possible to set up a SIPP, and if you breach the terms of the agreement, the rental agreement between you and the trustees, you could be in breach of contract. It's possible for people to be sued by the very vehicle they've created, in theory, for their own benefit. Sounds weird, but it can happen. Property as an asset is illiquid and non-divisible. So if you're thinking about holding something within your pension, think about how in practical terms that's going to help to fund your retirement. Remember, properties can be difficult to value, difficult to sell, and they can't be easily divided up. There are ways that people can create shares in vehicles that own property, but it's not straightforward. And basically, the problem within a self-invested personal pension from a personal point of view is you could be overexposed to property as an asset class and the fortunes of the business. Effectively, by doing this, you are tying yourself pretty heavily to what happens to the business and what happens to the property. Then there are costs, and these are to be weighed up carefully before going down this route of putting commercial property into a SIPP. They are many and varied. There are legal costs, setting the whole thing up, and then ongoing legal costs. And these can run into thousands of pounds very quickly, even on a relatively simple arrangement. Then there's tax. There's upfront stamp duty, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, and ongoing advice, for example, around VAT. And then there are the regular revaluation requirements, for example, where self-invested personal pension rules limit exposure to property within a SIPP. So you might have a situation where the SIPP rules say that only 1/3 of the assets within the self-invested personal pension can be commercial property. That limits the exposure, if you like. It maximises the diversification, but that's going to require you to get the property revalued in order to approve that. So there are situations where revaluations are required and they can be expensive and time consuming. And then there are what I call the hidden headaches. And these you should know about up front, because otherwise they can be a real pain if you don't know about them. So, for example, maintenance costs and rent need to be funded within the SIPP. Now that may be not a problem. It may be that you can save up and invest the rental income that's being received from, if you like, the business outside the SIPP into the SIPP. But you need to make sure legally that those costs are being met. There is also the potential, of course, for a breach of the lifetime allowance, and that's true of any asset. But if you put a big asset like an office building into a SIPP, then you straight away you've got to worry about revaluations, possible breaches of the lifetime allowance, which is set at just over £1 million at the moment, and how you're going to fund any associated tax penalty. And then there are possible restrictions on borrowing. For example, can the borrowing, the debt secured against the building, if you have such a thing, can that be with any third party? Are there limits on the amount? All of that needs to be written in up front and then monitored on an ongoing basis. So overall conclusions then would be what? Well, holding commercial property in a SIPP can be tax efficient in 4 different ways, and I've hinted at those earlier on. So this isn't a message to say nobody does it, it shouldn't be done. It can be done and people do, but that needs to be balanced against the costs of getting this sorted out and the ongoing costs too, the complexity and also some of the risks I've mentioned. So it's very much a case of seek professional advice on a case-by-case basis. There is rarely going to be a straightforward yes or no answer to should I do this. Any questions on what is quite a big topic? editor@killick.com. And if you're thinking about watching videos on pensions and trusts, for example, more generally, then killick.com/learn, and the tax effective savings tab would be a great place to start.